Hello everyone, this is Serious Trivia, and with the release of the All Under Heaven DLC for Crusader Kings 3, the question of which character to play for your first playthrough is surely on everyone's mind. And as an expert on Chinese history, I believe there are tons of interesting Chinese characters in all three start date to consider. But for my very first playthrough, which will be featured here on the channel starting tomorrow, I will be playing as Emperor Li Cui, or Emperor Yizong of the Tang Dynasty in the 867 start date. And as with my Three Kingdoms content, I feel it is always more fulfilling to play a historical game while knowing the historical background. So for this video, I will be doing a not so brief rundown of all the Tang Dynasty emperors leading up to Emperor Li Cui, or basically the history of the Tang Dynasty from the perspective of the imperial family. Now, because there are 18 emperors plus the only empress in the entirety of Chinese history to cover here, this will be quite a long video. So get comfortable, subscribe to the channel, and let's start our story back in year 566. At this time, the land that we call China today has been in a divided state for over a century, ever since the downfall of the Jin dynasty. While there were many smaller kingdoms and dynasties that would rise and fall in this century of chaos, historians now largely classify this period as the North-South dynasty after the North-South division that dominated this period. And in the year 566, in the northern state of Zhou, a boy by the name of Li Yuan would be born in the city of Chang'an. Now, Li Yuan's family is one of the premier military aristocrats from northwestern China, as his grandfather Li Hu was one of the esteemed 8 pillars of the state for the Western Wei dynasty, a predecessor to what eventually became the Northern Zhou dynasty. Given the chaos in this period, there are going to be a lot of different dynasty names being thrown around here. So to provide a bit of backdrop for those unfamiliar with this period in Chinese history, where many dynasties rose and fell in short order, we start with the Xianbei nomads who migrated into northern China during the decline of the Jin dynasty. They would slowly adopt Han customs, language, culture, and even bureaucracy as they would go on to create a powerful northern dynasty named Bei Wei, or Northern Wei. However, due to competing factions within the imperial court and a weakening imperial power, the Northern Wei would split in two in 534 as the western half became known as Xi Wei, or Western Wei, while the eastern half became known as Dong Wei, or the Eastern Wei. Initially, the Eastern Wei was stronger, which led the ruling regent of the Western Wei in Yuwentai to create a unique military system called Fu Bing Zhi, or the Fu Bing militia system, where 8 key families or clans were picked to raise independent and self-funded armies to help stabilize the key Longji region, where border skirmishes frequently happened between the two Wei dynasties. These 8 clans became known as the 8 pillars of the state, and the Li clan, led at the time by Li Hu, or Li Yuan's grandfather, was one of these 8 pillars. Now, by the time of Li Yuan's birth, Yuwentai, who was the main member of the 8 pillars, ended up usurping the throne of Western Wei from the ruling Tuoba clan, which is why the dynasty is now called Northern Zhou. Another thing to note here is that most of the 8 pillar clans are originally Xianbei clans who intermarried frequently with local Han gentry clans in the Longji region, and as the Xianbei eventually did away with their own language and culture, they also changed their clan names. For example, the Li clan, that would go on to become the ruling imperial clan of the Tang dynasty, used to be called the Daye clan in the Xianbei language before changing it to Li, which is their adopted Han clan name. In either case, Li Yuan was born into a very powerful clan, as his father Li Bing held the title of Duke of Tang in the Northern Zhou court, while his mother, Lady Du Gu, was the fourth daughter of another member of the Eight Pillars in Dugu Xin. Moreover, Lady Dugu's older sister was the Empress of Northern Zhou, while her younger sister was the wife of a young general named Yang Jian, who would eventually go on to form the Sui dynasty and unite all of China once again. So Li Yuan's life really couldn't get any easier, as when he was just 7 years old, his father would pass away, leaving him to become the Duke of Tang. Now, with his aunt as the empress and his uncle Yang Jian soon to become the prime minister before usurping to become the emperor of the new Sui dynasty, Li Yuan climbed the political ladder with ease as he would serve for a time as an imperial guard before switching to more civil roles as the prefect of 3 different provinces and the administrator of 2 different key commanderies. By the time of the Sui dynasty's second emperor, Emperor Yang Guang, Li Yuan would switch back to more military-focused roles as he was put in charge of logistics for the campaigns into Korea, before being sent to put down peasant rebellions and Tuzhou nomadic invasions in the north. Eventually, Emperor Yang Guang would put Li Yuan in charge of the key northern region around Taiyuan. Now, while the Sui dynasty was the first great power to reunite all of China after almost 4 centuries of division, the dynasty failed to survive long as over-ambitious military and civil affairs, such as the costly campaigns against Korea and the construction of the Grand Canal connecting all the key riverways spanning from northern China to southern China, drained the coffers and angered its citizens as peasant rebellions sprung up all across the land during the reign of the second emperor Yang Guang. These disturbances all across the country eventually caused Li Yuan, who is an uncle to Emperor Yang Guang, to start worrying about his own future in this faltering empire. And soon after he was placed in charge of Taiyuan, he was persuaded by his own son, Li Shimin, to rebel against the teetering Sui dynasty in 617. Due to his proximity to Chang'an, Li Yuan was able to quickly gain control of this ancient seat of power, as he would temporarily set up a puppet emperor while Yang Guang struggled in southern China. By the very next year, when Yang Guang perished, Li Yuan immediately did away with his puppet emperor, as he would officially usurp the Sui and establish the Tang dynasty in a callback to his clan's past title as the Duke of Tang. At this point, the land was still very much divided, as multiple regional rebel leaders split the country back into many rivaling factions. And for the next 6 years, Li Yuan would rely mostly on his militarily gifted second son, Li Shimin, to help reunite the entire land. Now, despite Li Shimin's military talents, he was still the second son, and this meant he was not destined for the throne, as his older brother, Li Jiancheng, was also a capable prince with broad support from the court. This underlying tension over who should become the crown prince became the central issue of Li Yuan's reign as emperor, as while he still needed his second son Li Shimin for military campaigns against the neighboring northern nomads and the steppe kingdoms in Central Asia, he also wanted to preserve the Han tradition of inheritance to the eldest son. And as a father, more than an emperor, Li Yuan avoided making this vital decision on the crown prince, which only made matters worse, as the relationship between his sons deteriorated to the point of no return. Eventually, in 626, Li Shimin decided to make this decision for his father, as the infamous Xuanwu Gate incident would occur, where in one fateful morning, Li Shimin launched an ambush with just 800 of his own personal guards at the Xuanwu Gate of the Imperial Palace against his 2 brothers in Li Jiancheng and Li Yuanji, where Li Shimin would not only end up killing both of his brothers and their families, but also ended up forcing his father Li Yuan to step down as emperor to make way for himself. Li Yuan would go on to live under house arrest, surrounded by the luxuries of the palace, until dying of natural causes at 70 years old. While this bloody takeover would forever become a blemish on Li Shimin's legacy, his rule would see the rise of a great Tang Empire that would expand to a size that would be unmatched in history, as Chang'an would become the capital of the known world. However, despite his success, later on in his life, Li Shimin started to deal with common issues that had plagued many past emperors, as he started to look towards Taoist alchemy as a means to everlasting life, which started the trend of crafting Zhan, or condensed elixirs in pill forms, as a trendy practice throughout the Tang dynasty by social elites. The consumption of these poisonous Zhan, which contained traces of mercury and other heavy metals, brought side effects to Li Shimin's temperament, as he ended up struggling with the inheritance issue of his own, as his longtime crown prince, Li Chengqian, constantly disappointed him. In the end, the ever-increasing pressure from a disapproving father pushed Li Chengqian to stage a military coup of his own in a similar fashion as his father's Xuanwu Gate affair, but unlike Li Shimin's successful coup that forced the abdication of his father, Li Chengqian's plot never got past the planning phase, as a rival prince and younger brother in Li Tai discovered the plot. Now faced with this rebellious son, Li Shimin ended up exiling Li Chengqian while also punishing Li Tai for his role in threatening the crown prince. This entire event had a huge impact on Li Shimin's mental and physical well-being, as troubled memories of his own coup and the regret of having to kill both of his brothers ended up influencing Li Shimin to pick his docile and gentle ninth son, Li Zhi, as the crown prince, as he no longer wanted to see any more bloodshed within the family. Then just 5 years later, in 649, Li Shimin, one of the most accomplished emperors of Chinese history, would pass away at just 51 years old due to a combination of health issues stemming from lingering battle wounds from his younger days, slow-paced mercury poisoning from his search for everlasting life, and depression from seeing how history almost repeated itself with his son's planned coup. And now, with Li Shimin's death, we now herald in the reign of Emperor Li Zhi, the third emperor of the Tang dynasty, while often overshadowed by his predecessor in Li Shimin and by his eventual successor in Empress Wu Zetian. Li Zhi was actually quite a capable emperor who ruled for over 3 decades. In his first decade, Li Zhi continued to rely on the key officials from his father's court, who were often known as the Longji faction, due to their various relationships to the Longji clans that even the Li clan was a part of. However, Li Zhi would end up breaking away from the Longji clans near the end of his first decade of rule over love. As you see, Li Zhi had fallen in love with a young concubine in Lady Wu, who was not his concubine, but a concubine of his late father Li Shimin. Now, traditionally, taking your father's concubine after his death is not something that the Han customs would allow, but because the Tang dynasty had a degree of nomadic roots, where this practice was much more common, it didn't become a huge issue initially for the court. However, when Li Zhi wanted to divorce his empress, Lady Wang, who was related to the Longji clan, on the grounds that she had not borne him any sons, when in reality, Li Zhi simply wanted to make concubine Wu the new empress. This decision caused massive pushback from the imperial court, which was up until this point still controlled by members of the Longji clans. Despite this pushback, Li Zhi and concubine Wu showed not only determination and love, but also political ambition, as they would go on to not only get the divorce that they desired, but also the consolidation of imperial power, as the Longji clan would end up being sidelined, jailed, and even massacred in this political reshuffling that ended with the concentration of power in the hands of the throne. Empress Wang was not only divorced, but was also eventually executed on the orders of the new empress. Now, up until this point in Chinese history, while empresses, and especially empress dowagers, have held significant political influence from time to time, they have only done so through proxies, usually in the form of imperial in-laws at court or through their underage emperor sons, while being regents themselves. Yet, starting in the year 660, or just 1 year after becoming the new empress, Empress Wu started to attend imperial court assemblies alongside Emperor Li Zhi as a ruling equal in an unprecedented move, as it goes without saying that gender equality has never been a core tenet of Confucianism or the ruling philosophy of China. Now, the reason for this stems from an ongoing health issue for Emperor Li Zhi, as he had always been prone to blackouts, likely caused by persistent high blood pressure, and this made it difficult for him to rule. So instead of relying on key officials at court, Li Zhi opted to rely on his beloved empress, as the Tang dynasty would herald in a period known as the Court of the Two Saints, or Er Sheng Lin Chao, in reference to the fact that Tang emperors were commonly referred to as Shengren, which can be roughly translated to being a saint. And the imperial court allowed this mainly because that under the rules of these two saints, the Tang dynasty oversaw a period of rapid expansion, from the destruction of the western Tujue court in Central Asia to the subjugation of the Gaogou Li in the Korean peninsula, a task that both Emperor Yangguang of the Sui dynasty and Emperor Li Shimin of the Tang dynasty failed to achieve. So, in another word, under the guidance of a physically unwell emperor and his ambitious and overstepping empress, the Tang dynasty expanded to the pinnacle of their military might. By 674, now entering the 25th year of his reign, Emperor Li Zhi did start to grow suspicious of his wife's ultimate endgame, as more and more of her allies were being placed into key positions at court. And for a period, Li Zhi did contemplate the removal of Empress Wu. However, due to his continued poor health and his still loving relationship with the Empress, Emperor Li Zhi eventually gave up on the idea. Instead, he decided to give the titles of Heavenly Emperor and Heavenly Empress to himself and Empress Wu, which further cemented Empress Wu's position as an equal ruler, as she would continue to establish support in the court until Emperor Li Zhi's eventual death 9 years later in 683. Now, in 683, Empress Wu did not take the throne right away, as 3 years prior to Emperor Li Zhi's passing, Li Zhi had already picked a crown prince in Xian, who was the third son between himself and Empress Wu. So naturally, upon Emperor Li Zhi's death, Xian became the fourth emperor of the Tang dynasty. However, while on his deathbed, Emperor Li Zhi made sure to pass an edict stating that if Xian should have any issues ruling at court, then his mother, the heavenly Empress Wu, can then step in to resolve any such matters. This edict would eventually play an important role in legitimizing Empress Wu's ascension in the future. But for the time being, Xian is now an emperor who ascends the throne at the age of 27. As the third son between the late Emperor Li Zhi and now Empress Dowager Wu, Xian grew up witnessing how his own ambitious mother forced both of his older brothers into their early graves. So immediately, Xian wanted to rid the court of his mother's influence. Unfortunately, with most of the court already allied to his mother, all Xian could do was to promote his father-in-law, Wei Xuanzhen, to the position of prime minister, in the hope that he can wrestle control of the imperial court. Now, the rashness of Xian's desire to sideline his own mother backfired, as just 55 days later, Empress Dowager Wu and her supporters at court carried out a bloodless purge, as Emperor Xian would be forced to abdicate the throne on the grounds of ineptitude in ruling. Xian would be exiled to become the Prince of Luling, where he would remain under surveillance in house arrest. Empress Dowager Wu then named her fourth son, Li Dan, as the new emperor. Now, Li Dan is actually one of the more interesting Tang emperors, in my opinion, but more on that later. As for the time being, Li Dan would be the definition of a puppet emperor, as he remained isolated in the rear palace, while his mother ruled in actuality from 684 to 690. During this period, many imperial relatives, namely regional princes and imperial clan loyalists, rebelled against Empress Dowager Wu's takeover at court. But they would all end up being crushed, as many Li clan members were jailed and slaughtered. This would become a particularly dark period in Tang Dynasty politics, and was especially grueling for Empress Dowager Wu's two sons, who lived constantly under the fear that their own mother would kill them. Xian, in particular, contemplated suicide countless times, but would persevere as his wife and former Empress Wei comforted him to carry on. Eventually, by 690, as the opposing factions were all removed, Empress Dowager Wu would take the name Zetian, as she would ascend the throne herself to become the first ruling empress of all of China. And when she approached her son, Li Dan, for the abdication, Li Dan obviously obliged, as he would return back to being just a prince, while for a moment the Tang dynasty ended, as the Li clan gave way to the Wu clan. Empress Wu Zetian would adopt a new dynasty name of Zhou and begin her reign in 690 at the age of 66. Now, despite her advanced age, Wu Zetian would go on to rule for 15 years, as the empire would hum along just fine, as there were many capable officials amongst her supporters. Chief among their policies would be the adoption of anonymous grading of the imperial examination, where the names of the exam takers would be hidden away before grading. And this helped to reduce cheating and cut back the gentry clan's monopoly in politics, while helping many talented commoners have a better shot to earn their way into the bureaucracy. And to help legitimize the empress's reign as the first female ruler in Chinese history, Wu Zetian also heavily promoted Buddhism as the localized version of the faith, made subtle changes to their teachings to help the general public accept being ruled by an empress who is divine. Of course, Buddhism had already been a huge part of the Tang Dynasty, as the story of the journey to the west was based on real events during the reign of Li Shimin. Now, deep into Wu Zetian's reign, and as she approached her late 70s, many of the same officials that had supported her ascension started to pressure her into picking an heir. At the time, there were two directions that she could have gone. She could either pick one of her sons with Emperor Li Zhi in Xian and Li Dan, who were both still alive, to essentially restore the Tang Dynasty, or she could pick her nephew, Wu Sansi. The latter choice would have been a continuation of the newly created Zhou Dynasty, but it would leave Empress Wu Zetian in an awkward position in history, as one of her staunchest supporters, official Dian Jie, reminded her that while history has repeatedly had sons who would conduct filial pious ancestral worship for their own parents, he has never heard of anyone doing the same for their aunt. Essentially, Wu Zetian ran the risk that her achievements might be altered or minimized in the history books if she picked her nephew, who might not be as thankful for her historical breakthrough as the first ruling empress. Conversely, if she restores the Li clan by picking her sons, then no matter how much they might resent her, with filial piety remaining a core tenet of Chinese culture, they will always have to honor her and her achievements in full. While not entirely convinced by this logic, Wu Zetian did agree to recall the long-exiled prince Xian, as Xian finally made his return to the new capital city of Luoyang. However, Xian's life did not get any better, as the closer he was to returning to power, the more plots were made against him, especially by Wu Zetian's relatives, who definitely did not want to see a power transfer back to the Li clan. In 705, an 81-year-old Wu Zetian finally fell deathly ill. But instead of waiting for her slow natural death, the imperial court finally made their move, as key officials who had been supporters of Wu Zetian conducted a military coup that forcefully removed her from the throne. They made this move because they did not want to risk any last-minute changes or plots by the other members of the Wu clan to take over. Wu Zetian would be placed under house arrest, where she would eventually die of her illness just a few months later at the age of 82. Her third son, Xian, the former fourth emperor of the Tang dynasty, is now restored back to the throne 21 years later. However, unlike his first time, Xian was no longer the same young and ambitious emperor eager for independent rule. After living with the constant fear of being killed for the past 2 decades, Xian is now a paranoid and cowering individual who only trusted his wife, Empress Wei, who stuck by his side throughout his exile. While there is nothing inherently wrong with this, Empress Wei was much more politically ambitious than her now weakened husband. And after just having seen the possibility of a ruling empress, Empress Wei and her daughter Anle Gongzhu, or the Princess of Anle, both now dreamed of a world where they would eventually inherit the throne one day. And to help achieve this goal, they decided to side themselves with Wu Sansi, who was also now desperate for new allies at court after the unceremonious end for his aunt. Together, this new political faction would quickly gain control of the imperial court as they plotted against top officials, who ended up either being marginalized or killed, as Emperor Xian turned a blind eye on these actions. In his mind, his wife could do no wrong, even though these were the same officials who carried out the coup that had led to his restoration. However, as this political purge continued, by 710, even Emperor Xian started to notice how power-hungry his wife and daughter were becoming. And just when he wanted to do something about it, the most unexpected thing happened, as his wife and daughter would end up poisoning his food in June of 710, leading to his early death. And yes, if you haven't noticed by now, the Tang dynasty is one of the most drama-filled dynasties in Chinese history, and there is just so much potential for CK3 to capture these events with its many game mechanics. Now, carrying on with our story, after Xian was poisoned to death, Empress Wei and Princess Anle tried to keep his death under wraps as they scrambled to place Xian's youngest son, Chongmao, as their puppet emperor. However, this plot ultimately failed, as the reign of Empress Wu not only inspired these other ladies to try to follow her footstep, but also warned the Li imperial clan of the dangers of ambitious empresses, as Xian's nephew, Longji, the son of the previous emperor Zhan, ended up forming a temporary political alliance with his aunt, Princess Taiping, a daughter of Empress Wu, to launch a military coup of their own that took control of the palace, as Empress Wei, Princess Anle, and all their supporters would be killed on the grounds of treason for poisoning the late emperor. Longji then handed the throne back to his father, Zhan, as the former fifth emperor of the Tang dynasty is also now restored. And although Zhan was already 48 years old, he was still no better than a puppet emperor in his second stint on the job, as he simply lacked ambition, which is probably what also helped keep him alive during the reign of Empress Wu. Now, back on the throne, Zhan mostly stayed out of the way of the two dominant factions at court, led by his son, Longji, and his sister, Princess Taiping. While these two had teamed up to put Zhan back on the throne, the ambitious nature of these two put them on a rivaling path, as both now wanted to take the throne for themselves after Zhan. Now, because Longji was Zhan's son, he had the inherent advantage of becoming the crown prince, while Princess Taiping needed overwhelming court support to even have a chance. But the thing is, Princess Taiping had that type of pull at court, as 5 of the 7 prime ministers were loyal to her. So for the next 2 years, Princess Taiping tried her best to leverage the court to remove Li Longji from the crown prince position. But to her surprise, her brother, Emperor Li Dan, made an unlikely move in 712, as he would become one of the few emperors in Chinese history to voluntarily step down as emperor, thus gifting the throne to his son and crown prince Li Longji to become the 7th emperor of the Tang dynasty. Now, initially, Li Dan still reserved some appointment power for the top officials of the court, and still allowed his sister, Princess Taiping, to keep her influence. But Li Longji took no chances with his ambitious aunt, as just a year later, he would launch a preemptive strike against his aunt, as her faction at court would be slaughtered in a strong-arm military crackdown, while she would be ordered to commit suicide. After Princess Taiping's death, Li Dan lost all desire to keep any power, as he would retire entirely to allow Li Longji to run the show for himself. Li Dan would die of natural causes 3 years later at the age of 55. Now, with all of Empress Wu's children dead, it's truly the end of an era, as the Tang dynasty will soon herald in a true golden age under her grandson Li Longji, who would become the longest reigning emperor of the Tang dynasty, as he would rule for the next 5 decades from 712 to 762. Under Li Longji, the Tang dynasty will implement stricter review systems for officials that would improve the overall efficiency for the administration. Investments in irrigation and flood prevention will lead to better harvests, greatly reducing food prices and increasing supplies available to fund a growing army that now had a massive empire to defend. Speaking of the army, one of Li Longji's biggest policy changes would be the creation of the initial 10 semi-independent frontier general/administrators called 节度使. While this move made the borders safer, it also created these overly powerful generals that had essentially unchecked power within their respectively assigned regions. Now, for those who know their Tang history, you know exactly what will happen, but before we get to that point, we have to acknowledge that this new system worked well for over 3 decades, as the Tang dynasty peaked in every arena, including cultural advancements in the fields of literature and art, as most of the famous Tang poets that we know today, such as Li Bai, Du Fu, and Wang Wei, lived in this period. Yet once you have peaked, the only direction left to go would be down. And things started to go downhill for the Tang dynasty, starting around 742, as Li Longji went from a young man eager to push his empire to great heights to a prideful old man ready to enjoy the fruits of his labor, as Li Longji started to delegate the court affairs to yes-mans like Prime Minister Li Linfu, while he spent most of his time with his favorite concubine Yang Yuhuan. His love for concubine Yang became an ever-increasingly expensive affair as he heaped unimaginable luxuries at her feet. Her clan were also elevated to key government positions, such as the prime minister role for her cousin, Yang Guozhong, who became one of the most corrupt officials at the time. And it was also under the guidance of this group of corrupt prime ministers that the decision was made to put foreigners in the key role of 节度使. Prime Minister Li Linfu believed that by using foreigners, who were seen as uncultured in the Han ideology in these positions, they would not become future competitors of his at court. And for those who are wondering about the term foreigner here, you have to understand that because of the sheer size of the Tang Empire that stretched from Central Asia to the Korean Peninsula, there were actually a lot of foreigners or non-Han officials, including steppe nomads and even Muslims from the Middle East, as it was a very inclusive court. But this decision to use foreigners in the key 节度使 position would become the final straw, especially with the appointment of An Lushan, who was of Sagadan and Gokturk origins. The main issue with An Lushan was not that he was a foreigner, but rather he became immensely favored at court for his dancing. As you see, An Lushan was very short and very fat, but super nimble on his feet, and his dancing skills caught the eyes of both the emperor and his beloved concubine Yang, as concubine Yang would even end up adopting An Lushan as an adopted son, even though he was older than her. While this might sound very goofy, An Lushan leveraged this relationship into becoming the Jiedushi of not one, not two, but 3 border regions. So in essence, he ended up single-handedly controlling the tax incomes of 3 vital border provinces and had an army that totaled more than 200,000 of the Tang dynasty's best troops. This force represented 40% of the entire Tang armies at the time. Eventually, in 755, after having witnessed the corruption and ineptitude of the imperial court, An Lushan pulled the trigger and rebelled. And to give his rebellion a legitimate reason, An Lushan claimed that he was only rebelling to remove the corrupt prime minister Yang Guozhong and not to usurp the throne for himself. But when his army of 150,000 strong conquered the key city of Luoyang with ease, An Lushan went ahead and created a new dynasty called Da Yan, with himself as its founding emperor. So now, with his true intentions shown, An Lushan would go on to march for Chang'an, and after defeating the garrison at the final line of defense at Tong Gate, the city of Chang'an evacuated, as it was simply too big to try to defend, as Emperor Longji, now in his early 70s, was forced to flee the once illustrious capital. On their escape, the convoy made a pit stop at a rest stop called Ma Wei Po, as the army that was escorting and protecting the emperor ran out of food. The frustration from the supply issue and the general decline of the once powerful empire finally boiled over as this escorting army would launch one of their own coup. But fortunately, their frustration and coup was not targeted at their emperor, but instead at concubine Yang and her relative, the corrupt Prime Minister Yang Guozhong, who they saw as the cause of this rebellion in the first place. Yang Guozhong would be killed outright before the troop ended up pressuring their emperor into killing his beloved concubine. After this episode, the army resumed their escort of the emperor, as they would eventually escape to the safety of Sichuan. However, another major side effect of this brief military coup was that the crown prince, Heng, decided to go his own way, as he instead turned north to become a leader for the loyal government forces that remained in battle against the rebels. Heng's decision here would become a vital turning point, as he would actually unilaterally crown himself as the emperor, marginalizing his father's already beleaguered reign. But this was the correct decision for the Tang dynasty, as the government forces under Heng's leadership were able to rally back, as the rebellion, which was suffering from severe infighting itself, as An Lushan would actually be killed in 757, just 2 years after starting his rebellion, when his own son, An Qingxu, killed him to seize power for himself. What followed would be a series of setbacks for the rebels, as Chang'an and Luoyang would all be retaken by the government forces, forcing the rebels to retreat back north to the city of Ye. However, just when the rebellion looked like it was going to end, An Lushan's former subordinate, Shimin, who had already surrendered to the government forces, saw this as an opportunity for himself to seize power, as he would switch back to siding with the rebels, as he would kill An Qingxu to take full control of the rebel forces. Under his new leadership, the rebels would bounce back and retake Luoyang, but then, just when the rebels were gaining some ground, another infighting would break out, as, can you believe it, Shimin's son, Shi Chaoyi, would kill his own father too, to seize power for himself. Now, with the rebellion dragging on into its 7th year, both emperors in Longji and his son Heng would pass away to natural causes. Old age for Longji, followed by illness for his son, just a few months later in late 762. And with their death, Li Heng's son and Crown Prince Li Yu would inherit the throne to become the ninth emperor of the Tang dynasty. Now, Li Yu had already been in charge of the military during the fight against the rebels, but despite his accomplishment, his ascension to the throne was not a smooth ride, as it would not be the Tang dynasty without more court intrigue. This time, it would be another empress, in Empress Zhang, who was the wife of Li Yu's father Li Heng, who tried to remove Li Yu from the crown prince position to support her own son Li Si. This plot happened all while Emperor Li Heng was ill on his deathbed, but it ultimately failed when Li Yu and key eunuch officials who supported him responded with a violent military crackdown that would kill both Empress Zhang and Prince Li Si. It is said that this bloody event in the palace is what ultimately pushed the gravely ill Emperor Li Heng to draw his last breath. Now, what was left for the new emperor is the land that was still dealing with what will become known as the Anshi Rebellion, named after An Lushan and Shi Siming, the two rebel leaders of this rebellion. By utilizing the talented but marginalized general Guo Ziyi and leveraging mercenary cavalries borrowed from the Uyghur Khaganate out west, Emperor Li Yu finally crushed the rebellion in spring of 763, ending this devastating rebellion that lasted for 8 long years. While finally victorious, the impact of the Anshi Rebellion would be felt for a long time, as most of the battle happened in the wealthy population centers of the Tang Empire that stretched from Chang'an to Luoyang. The recorded number of taxable households in this region prior to the rebellion was 9 million, and by the end of the rebellion, this number had crashed down to just 2 million. Additionally, while the powerful Jiedushi position was the key cause of the rebellion, the central government had no choice but to further empower the remaining Jiedushi to an even higher degree of independence in order to keep their loyalty and support in crushing the rebellion. Now that the rebellion was over, the weakened central government had no means to take back the power that they had bestowed, and this ended up creating autonomous regional warlords that ate into the already dwindling taxable base for the Tang Empire and the ticking time bomb for future rebellions. The need for troops to fight the rebellion also drained the western garrisons as the Tang effectively lost control of its vast holdings into Central Asia, as foreign powers such as the Tibetan Empire or Tubo moved into these lands. Even the Uyghur Khaganate, who had helped the Tang put down this rebellion by leasing their elite cavalry mercenaries, ended up seizing on this weakness to spread their influence deep into the Tang territories. Internally speaking, the late Emperor Li Heng needed a new faction at court to help balance the powers of the generals, as while they were helping the Tang defeat the current rebels, the emperor feared that they will one day become too powerful themselves and could eventually become rebels themselves. So the solution that he came up with was to put eunuchs into key military posts, especially around the capital. And even though empowering the eunuch has historically never ended well, eunuchs who are castrated male servants of the emperor had a much lower risk of treason because they were much closer to the emperor, and more importantly, they can no longer reproduce, and therefore they can't go on to form their own dynasties. Of course, because eunuch had this innate political ceiling, this often led them to being more corrupt, as wealth in their lifetime is probably their highest calling. But for emperors who are worried about their own generals or court officials rebelling to end their dynasty, eunuchs always seem like the most logical choice, especially for weak emperors or empires on the decline. Now, with all these issues in place, Emperor Li Yu starts his reign, as even though they were able to defeat the rebels in early 763, peace was not restored to the land, as the invasion of the Tibetan Empire out west finally reached the capital city of Chang'an. And once again, with the city nearly impossible to defend due to its sheer size, Emperor Li Yu had no choice but to abandon the city, and for a second time, a Tang emperor would abandon its capital. Fortunately, this time, the Tang armies was able to retake the city in just 15 days, as the Tibetan forces would retreat for the time being. Nonetheless, even the temporary loss of its capital became a national embarrassment for the new regime. This weakness forced Li Yu to cede even more power to three of the most dominant Jiedu in the Hebei region, as they were allowed to essentially become semi-autonomous kingdoms within the Tang Empire. Key generals who had helped defeat the Anshu rebels were now being marginalized by the eunuch officials sent to check their power, which led to another minor rebellion when Pugu Huai'en, a general of Tiele origins, ended up deciding to turn coat to join the Tibetan Empire out of spite for the eunuchs. And while the Tang armies would eventually kill him, his aid to the Tibetan Empire only added to the threat on the Western Front for a now declining Tang power. By 779, just 7 years into his reign, Emperor Li Yu would die of illness at the age of 53. In summary, he was an emperor that inherited a mess, and throughout his reign, he tried his best to fix it, as his civil policies restored a degree of prosperity to the war-torn regions, while his military policies managed to at least maintain a surface level of peace for the Tang Empire. Li Yu's eldest son, Li Kuo, would inherit the throne and become the 10th emperor of the Tang dynasty. Now, Li Kuo was born in 742, making him 37 years old at the time of his ascension to the throne. But more importantly, Li Kuo witnessed the golden age of the Tang dynasty in his youth, while also living through its decline. By the end of the Anshu rebellion, Li Kuo was the symbolic supreme commander for the government forces, and because of his contributions toward ending the rebellion and his status as the eldest prince, Li Kuo was named the crown prince soon after, without any dissensions. And perhaps because he was an eyewitness to the decline of the empire, his goals after becoming emperor centered around its restoration. Leading by example, he applied frugal measures to the imperial palace, cutting back the number of maids and ending the annual tribute of luxuries from frontier provinces, as Li Kuo wanted to root out the corruption that rotted at the core of the empire. To replenish the dwindling state treasury, Li Kuo would revolutionize the Chinese tax code, as over 4 centuries of land and population-based taxes would be replaced to a more asset-based tax system that would in the short term help both the state and its citizens. However, in the long run, the shortfalls of this new system led to long-lasting financial issues that is simply too complex to discuss in the scope of this video, but in essence, Li Kuo's tax reforms benefited his reign greatly and helped the Tang dynasty recover from decades of rebellions that it had just suffered through, but it also laid the foundation for future overtaxation, monetary squeeze, and eventually peasant rebellions that would ultimately doom the dynasty. Yet that would be decades later, as for the time being, the state coffers was replenished, and Li Kuo moved on to his next reform, where he would severely cut back the powers of the eunuchs as they had grown a bit too powerful under the 2 previous emperors. And with his success in curbing the powers of the eunuchs, Li Kuo then attempted a similar measure against the Jiedu, as he mainly wanted to end the hereditary inheritance of this powerful position, because as it stands, the current system has sons simply replacing their fathers as Jiedu, which meant that the central government has lost the power of appointment to these positions, and they essentially became hereditary kingdoms living within a Tang empire. So in 781, when Li Baochen, the Jiedu of the Chengde region, passed away, Emperor Li Kuo stepped in to prevent his son, Li Huaiyue, from inheriting the position. However, unlike the eunuchs, the Jiedu has the power to fight back, as Li Kuo's decision here would spur not only the rebellion of Li Huaiyue, but also 3 other Jiedu regions, as they all saw Li Kuo's reform as a threat to their power. This rebellion would become known as the Sizhen Zhiluan, or the Rebellion of the 4 Regions. Now, Li Kuo was not oblivious to this possibility, and he did prepare for this result, as he had support from a few loyal Jiedu who would step in to help him fight off the rebels for the time being. However, just as it seemed the government forces was going to win and crush this rebellion, as 3 of the 4 original rebelling Jiedushi were killed, many of the loyal Jiedushi aiding the emperor started to question their own fates in the future, as it became apparently clear that the emperor had set up this perfect ploy where the most disloyal Jiedushi were forced to rebel, then the loyal ones like themselves comes in and help him kill the disloyal ones. And in this process, the strength of all the Jiedushi are being weakened, as their troops were the ones dying in the fighting. Then once the rebellion comes to an end, the emperor can then try to force all the remaining Jiedushi to give up their power. Sensing that this might become their fate, 4 of the loyal Jiedushi decided to rebel themselves in the winter of 782, as 4 independent kingdoms of Ji, Zhao, Qi, and Wei would be formed with 4 new Jiedushi now officially calling themselves kings. This move then inspired another Jiedushi in Huaixi to follow suit, as the rebellion of the 4 regions grew to cover almost half of the country. Yet Emperor Li Kuo was still not ready to give up, as he still had plenty of troops under his command. However, when these troops were now being redeployed to deal with these new rebellions, there was widespread discontent about the quality of the food and wages for the common soldier, who were only being fed on coarse grain and scrap vegetables with no meat at all on the menu. This discontent finally boiled over as the troops were marching past the capital city of Chang'an, as the sights of decadence, corruption, and waste of the illustrious capital caused a massive mutiny, as this grand capital would suffer through another round of looting, while even Emperor Li Kuo would be forced to flee for safety of the nearby city of Fengtian. Here, the emperor would remain under siege for the next 3 months until Li Kuo finally decided to write an edict of apology to all the rebelling Jiedushi in the land. In this edict, Li Kuo owned up to the fact that his reforms to curb the power of Jiedushi were out of bounds, and that it was his fault that the land is once again in turmoil. Li Kuo offered to return to the policy of the past, granting hereditary inheritance for the Jiedushi position and complete pardons to all rebelling Jiedushi if they were willing to cancel their king titles and return back to being officials of the Tang Empire. While a simple edict will not be the cure-all for all the issues of the Tang dynasty, it did actually convince 3 of the rebelling Jiedushi to switch sides and improve the situation for Emperor Li Kuo. Yet just a month later, 2 new Jiedushi rebelled, and this time in the west, as it would force him to once again flee the capital. But despite this, the edict did give the government forces enough breathing room and new allies to slowly end this rebellion, as by May of 784, Chang'an would be retaken, and by the fall of 785, all the Jiedushi rebellions would be put down. Yet, with this failed reform, the Jiedushi system would survive and actually thrive, just with new officials replacing the ones that had been killed for rebelling. The embarrassment of the apology edict and the month in exile from the capital, where he had to fear for his life, completely changed Emperor Li Kuo, as he would transform from being an emperor eager for reforms to one that had lost all his ambitions. He became increasingly paranoid of court officials as he saw how quickly some of them switched sides for their own self-interest during the darkest days of the rebellion, and this made him turn towards empowering eunuchs once again by giving them control of the military, as they were the only group whose loyalty never wavered, as they were often the ones to protect him during those most dangerous parts of the exile. Furthermore, because political reform were no longer a possibility, Li Kuo spent most of his final decade of ruling gathering personal wealth, increasing taxes, asking for more exotic tributes in order to entertain himself. All these decisions would just add more strain to a already faltering empire. But even in this weakened state, the military might of the Tang Empire cannot be understated, as during the last decade of Li Kuo's reign, the Tibetan Empire tried to invade Sichuan 4 times, and all 4 of these invasions would be repelled with massive casualties suffered by the Tibetan Empire. And by the late 790s and early 800s, the Tang army even started to counterattack deep into Tibetan lands as lost lands from the Anshe rebellion period would be reclaimed. Now, as the calendar turned to the year 805, the New Year celebration in the palace would be interrupted by news of a particularly bad stroke suffered by the crown prince Li Song. This troubling news ended up negatively influencing the health of Emperor Li Kuo as well, for Li Kuo was already 64 years old. Li Kuo would end up battling this illness for the next 20 days before finally passing away in early 805. With Li Kuo's death, his eldest son and crown prince Li Song naturally inherits the throne as the 11th emperor of the Tang dynasty. But as we just mentioned, Li Song, who was also now in his 40s, had just suffered a significant stroke that led him partially paralyzed and even unable to speak. Despite this, Li Song inherited the throne with a strong desire for reform, as unlike his father, who had lost his will to change the status quo after the rebellion of the 4 regions, Li Song had been plotting to reform the country for the past 3 decades, as before suffering the stroke, Li Song had been a capable crown prince for 26 years, the longest in the history of the entire Tang dynasty. And during this time, he gathered many young, talented, and ambitious officials who thought to reform and save the Tang from its current issues. So now, with Li Song finally on the throne, even with health issues and becoming a mute, these officials got started right away as they pushed for 4 major changes. First and foremost, they thought to once again curb back the powers of the eunuchs as they hoped to strip them of their military commands. Against the Jiedushi, the reforms were much more conservative, as even these eager reformers wanted to avoid another widespread rebellion, as their only wish here was to restrict the size of the regions controlled by the Jiedushi to the original mandated lands, as all the newly conquered land should go back to belonging to the central government. Thirdly, they hoped to crack down on the corruption of the government officials. And finally, they wanted to curb back the spendings of the Imperial Palace, as things had gotten out of hand during those latter years of the last emperor. While these reforms looked great on paper, they ran into an issue right away, as the eunuchs decided to fight back to preserve their new gained powers. Seeing how weak the new emperor was, with Li Song in a state of poor health and unable to speak for himself, the eunuch used their control of the Imperial Palace guards to lock down the capital in August of 805, as they would force Emperor Li Song to step down. In his place, Li Song's eldest son, Li Chun, was put on the throne, as once again, because eunuchs can't usurp a dynasty, they were just hoping for regime change to help stop these reforms from happening. Li Song would be locked away in a rear palace where his health conditions would eventually take his life just 4 months later in January of 806, although there are a lot of theories where he would actually be secretly killed by the eunuchs. But in any case, the Tang dynasty welcomed its 12th emperor in Li Chun, who would actually spur a renaissance for the faltering power, as many historians would consider his reign to be a second golden age for the Tang dynasty. For civil policies, Li Chun leaned on his talented prime ministers as they strengthened the treasury through tax reforms on salt and improvements to the canal logistics. And while he was given the throne through a military coup led by the eunuchs, Li Chun still chose to continue the policies of his father, as eunuchs were slowly phased out of the military. And speaking of the military, the reason why Li Chun's reign is considered a second golden age is because he became the first Tang emperor to successfully curb back the powers of the Jiedushi. And it wasn't easy, as just 1 year after he ascended the throne in 806, the Jiedushi in charge of the Shu lands, named Liu Pi, decided to rebel after the emperor refused to allow him to expand his territories. In Liu Pi's mind, the young emperor is merely making the same mistakes that his forefathers had made during the rebellion of the four regions. However, Liu Pi was very wrong, as Li Chun did not try to turn one Jiedushi against another, or even lean on other Jiedushi to put down this rebellion. Instead, Li Chun sent the central government's own army this time, as all the other Jiedushi watched on the sidelines, eager to see the result of this first test of the new regime. Now, since Liu Pi was the one to initiate the rebellion, he did enjoy an early victory, as his armies forcefully took control of the neighboring region that he had wanted from the emperor. But once the central government armies entered the Shu lands in June of 806, Liu Pi was pushed back immediately, suffering one defeat after another, and in just a short 4 months, Liu Pi would be defeated, as he would be even captured alive, escorted back to Chang'an, and publicly executed for all to see. Then just 1 year later, Emperor Li Chun managed to flip one of Zhenhai's Jiedushi's generals to betraying his boss, as he would launch an internal coup to capture the Jiedushi while providing evidence of the Jiedushi's plot of rebellion. And without even having to lose a single troop, the young emperor managed to resolve another Jiedushi region. Riding off this success, Emperor Li Chun attempted to launch an outright attack on one of the Jiedushi, who had originally been responsible for the rebellion of the four regions, but after fighting to a stalemate from 809 to 810, the central government decided to accept the draw and pull back, as further investment toward this campaign no longer made sense. Overall, in these early years of Emperor Li Chun, the central government pushed all the right buttons against the Jiedushi, even in this stalemate, as despite the draw, the willingness shown by the central government to punish Jiedushi, who had shown signs of disloyalty in the past, sent a clear message to all the other Jiedushi in the land. And the timely acceptance of the draw kept the central government forces strong enough to project power to keep most of the Jiedushi in line. In 810, in another first, the He Shuo Jiedushi, who had previously refused to pay any tribute at all to the government, suddenly not only started to pay tribute, but also personally asked for an imperial court position, as he expressed his willingness to voluntarily resign from the Jiedushi position and traded in for a lucrative desk job back in the capital. Now, this had never happened before, and Li Chun happily accepted, as he once again showed all the other Jiedushi that if they were willing to reintegrate with the central government, then the central government is willing to show them leniency and respect. And indeed, similar opportunities would continue to occur, as in 812, when the current Jiedushi of the Weibo region passed away, leaving behind only a 11-year-old son, Emperor Li Chun and his prime ministers debated if they should strike and reclaim this region while it was weak with the child leader. In the end, they decided that instead of wasting money on launching a military campaign, they could just wait until the generals within that region revolted against this child, as surely none of these generals could resist the temptation of seizing power from an 11-year-old. Then at that point, with the money they saved on not launching a military campaign, they could then award the money to the general who wins and convince them to reintegrate the Jiedushi region back into the central government. And this is indeed what happened, as internal military coup against the child Jiedushi would occur, and after receiving a 1.5 million reward from the central government, the general ended up surrendering 6 provinces of Weibo back to the imperial court. Now, the biggest test for Li Chun's reign would come in 814, when the incumbent Jiedushi in the powerful Huaixi region passed away. His successor, Wu Yuanji, took over without even reporting his father's death to the central government, as after all, the Wu clan have ruled over Huaixi for over 3 generations by this point in a semi-autonomous manner. This obviously upset Emperor Li Chun, who then ordered his prime ministers to survey and plot out battle plans against Huaixi, which was a very wealthy southern region controlling not only vast farmlands, but also key canals that were vital to transportation of goods from southern China to northern China. Here, the central government showed a lot of patience as they carefully crafted a plan for 3 years before finally launching their campaign in 817. Yet no amount of preparation could overcome the strength of the Huaixi armies as they held strong in defense. And nearing the end of 817, the court started to debate if it should once again accept that it was going to be a stalemate and retreat the armies before another year of supplies would be wasted into this campaign. Fortunately for Li Chun, his talented prime minister, Pei Du, stepped up and offered to go to the front lines himself to deliver a victory for the court. With Pei Du in command, a daring march behind enemy lines would be planned in late October of 817, as Pei Du decided to risk it all with just a 9,000 troop forced march through an unlikely southern blizzard that had whitened out the skies. And in the course of a night, this small strike team marched behind the covers of a maddening blizzard to circle behind the home base of Yuanji in Caizhou, where Yuanji kept only a small garrison as he was not expecting any enemies at all. And thus, in one daring strike, the government forces captured the rebelling Jiedushi and forced the remaining rebel troops to stand down as Huaixi was reclaimed, while Yuanji would be escorted back to the capital to be executed. More importantly, this victory showed all the remaining Jiedushi that the central government was more than capable of crushing all of them, as many would voluntarily start to cede power and land back to the central government. And finally, after a period of more than 5 decades of chaos and scattered rule, the Tang Empire regained control of most of its land, and a second golden age had arrived. However, along with the second golden age came a change in Emperor Li Chun, as after all the success that he had enjoyed in his first decade of ruling, the hubris started to creep in as he stopped listening to many of the critiques from key court officials when he had welcomed them in the past. He also started to hire a large number of Taoist alchemists who claimed that they could craft him the Zhan of everlasting life, and much like some of his ancestors before him, after subjugating himself to a slow mercury poisoning, one of the side effects is a change in temperament to being more short-tempered and paranoid, as he slowly distanced himself from his top officials and generals to instead embrace eunuchs, as once again, eunuchs were empowered to hold key military positions in the capital. With the eunuchs back in power, 2 rivaling eunuch factions would actually emerge based on which of Li Chun's sons they were supporting for the position of crown prince, as while Li Chun's Empress Guo did birth him a son in Li Heng, he was not the eldest son. Instead, Li Chun's favorite concubine had the honor of delivering his eldest son in Li Ning, who ended up becoming the crown prince despite not being born from the empress, which is against traditions, as you want the eldest son from the main wife, not the eldest son overall. Yet Li Ning would die quite young, leading to a period of uncertainty over the crown prince position, as half of the eunuchs supported Li Chun's second oldest son now in Li Yun, while the remaining eunuchs supported the empress's son in Li Heng. This rivalry would prove important, as by 820, the mercury poisoning for Emperor Li Chun had become so bad that he had to cancel the New Year's assembly with the imperial court, while his short-fused temperament also had him lashing out at everything to the point where he would just kill random eunuchs in sight. So with their emperor in this crazed state, key eunuch officials supporting Prince Li Heng decided to take matters into their own hands, as they would end up killing the emperor in secret while telling the court that the emperor had died from taking the latest batch of Zhan. They then proceeded to herald Li Heng onto the throne while launching a military crackdown within the imperial palace to kill the eunuchs that were supporting the rivaling prince, as this would not have been the last time that the succession of the Tang dynasty came at the hands of the eunuchs. Now, unlike his father, Li Heng was born in 795, so he never witnessed any of the dark periods of the Tang, and naturally, he took the current golden age for granted, as he became an emperor focused on pleasure. Li Heng ordered for the construction of new palaces, spent his days playing a sport called Ma Qiu, which is similar to modern day polo, where teams on horsebacks would strike a ball with a wooden stick to score points. And he particularly liked hosting large banquets where drinks and women would be indulged and shared between him and key officials. On the military front, Li Heng foolishly believed that his father's achievements in curbing the powers of Jiedushi was a done deal, as he ordered the central government to cut back spending by firing 8 out of every 100 troops every year in a measure to save money. This not only weakened the central government's army's fighting strength, but also created a sizable population of now jobless veterans who often ended up becoming bandits or marauders as they had no other useful skill aside from fighting and killing. By the second year of Li Heng's reign, the previously suppressed Jiedushi regions in northern Hebei started to rebel, and with the central government now weakened, they easily regained independence. Yet these events barely fazed Li Heng as he continued to enjoy his days playing Ma Qiu until one day in early 823, while in a match with his eunuchs, one of the eunuch riders fell off his horse after being struck in the face during the match. The frightful sight of the accident spooked the emperor into calling off the match, and while he was recovering from the incident in his palace, Li Heng suffered a stroke that paralyzed his legs. Then for the next year, Li Heng, like his father before him, turned to Taoist alchemists in hope that they could produce a dun that could heal him. Unfortunately, Li Heng ended up taking so many dun in that one year that by early 824, heavy metal poisoning would claim his life, cutting his reign to just 4 short years. Yet despite the short reign, the damage to the empire was done, as Emperor Li Chun's short-lived Second Golden Age was no more. Li Heng will leave the throne to his eldest son, Li Zhan, who had just turned 16 when he ascended the throne. And unfortunately for the Tang dynasty, Li Zhan was just like his father, as instead of worrying about matters of state, Li Zhan just wanted to enjoy life and play. In addition to his father's favorite sport Ma Qiu, Li Zhan's vices also included cuju, a primitive version of soccer, the night hunting of foxes, and hosting wrestling tournaments. Because many of his favorite activities happened at night, including late-night Ma Qiu matches, Li Zhan rarely attended morning assemblies with the imperial court, as he hung out mostly with eunuchs. So once again, the eunuchs were empowered to help him run the country while he focused on entertainment. Now, despite being empowered, it was not great being a eunuch during Li Zhan's reign, as the young emperor had a competitive, cruel, and unforgiving personality that he took out on the eunuchs. For example, if a eunuch teammate of his were to cost him a match, he would instantly have them killed. This type of pressure eventually drove some of the eunuchs into taking extreme measures, as just 2 years into the reign of Li Zhan, he would be killed by 3 eunuchs after spending the evening hunting for foxes, playing a match of Ma Qiu in the middle of the night, before hosting a banquet with officials where he would have too much to drink. At the time of Li Zhan's death, he was just 18 years old. And even though Li Zhan had sons, they did not get a chance at the throne because of the nature of Li Zhan's death. After Li Zhan was murdered, the group of eunuchs who committed the regicide tried to put one of the baby princes onto the throne, but their actions would soon be discovered by another more powerful group of eunuchs, who then launched a military crackdown in the palace, resulting in the execution of not just the 3 eunuchs who had killed Li Zhan, but also Li Zhan's prince. In his place, Li Zhan's younger brother, Prince Liang, would now be thrown onto the throne to become the 15th emperor of the Tang dynasty in the year 826. And as a reminder, this would be yet another instance in this middle period of the Tang dynasty where it would be up to the eunuchs to decide who ends up on the throne. Now, Liang, who is the second son of Emperor Li Heng and the younger brother of the late Emperor Li Zhan, was just 17 years old when he got placed on the throne. And unlike his two predecessors, Liang was the studious one in the family, and having witnessed how the eunuchs have played a direct role in the death of both his father and brother, Liang's reign could be best described as a battle against the eunuchs. Initially, Liang tried to empower his prime ministers as a mean to marginalize the powerful eunuch faction, but this plan failed when eunuch officials easily dispatched most of Liang's early appointees with evidences of wrongdoings, as not only did the eunuchs control the military forces in the capital, they also operated extensive spying network that tracked all the key officials and even the emperor. Seeing that he could not outwit the eunuchs through the proper channels, Emperor Liang then tried to set up an ambush against the key leaders of the eunuch faction, with the few garrisons of troops that still remained loyal to him. But this plot failed terribly as the eunuch leaders sniffed out the ambush just in time to flee back to the palace, where they rallied 500 of the Imperial Palace guards loyal to them to kidnap the emperor and arrest officials on the grounds of treason. And by the time this crackdown was over, all four prime ministers would be executed, even though only two were involved. And beyond the prime minister positions, over 600 imperial court officials, many of whom were innocent and not involved in the plot, would all be killed, along with thousands more of their family members, as this bloody incident became known in history as the Ganlu incident. From this point on, the imperial court became essentially empty, with the eunuchs now empowered to pick the next appointees, as Emperor Liang himself would end up becoming a prisoner of the servants in his own palace. And for a time, the Tang dynasty would end up being ruled entirely by the eunuch faction. During this period of house arrest in the palace, Emperor Liang would become depressed as he was also often mistreated, and just 5 years later, he would die at the age of 31. After his death, the eunuch did away with his plan of passing the throne to his son, as they would end up picking his younger brother in Li Yan to become the 16th emperor of the Tang dynasty. Now, Li Yan was not like his playful eldest brother, Li Zhan, or his studious second brother, Li Ang. Instead, Li Yan was a stoic, firm, and decisive young man who was also a keen believer in Taoism. Well aware that the eunuch were a major problem, Li Yan knew he needed to create an even stronger power at court to help him curb the eunuch's powers, and to achieve this, he condensed the powers of the various prime minister positions into one, as he would end up entrusting official Li Deyu with essentially regent level of power at court. And once Li Deyu was strong enough to dictate the court, the eunuch powers were slowly stripped away one by one until they were finally marginalized once again. For internal policies, Li Yan decided to launch a nationwide attack on the Buddhist faith. Now, of course, this decision was influenced by his own personal Taoism belief, but also well rooted in national interest. By the 840s, Buddhism had grown to become a massive entity in the Tang Empire, with its own bureaucracy, finances, and influence that rivaled even the political bureaucracy that ran the state. Buddhist monks and temples were tax exempt. Therefore, many temples had exploited this favorable tax policy to purchase large amounts of land and slave labor to further enrich themselves. Additionally, monks were exempt from corvée labor, military conscription, and do not marry and help grow the population due to their faith. So in the eyes of the state, Buddhist monks were a social burden. So to correct all of this, Emperor Li Yan ordered for the destruction of over 4,600 Buddhist temples across the land, as quotas were established for the number of temples allowed in each region. The number of monks per temple were also restricted, as over 260,000 monks and nuns would be forced to abandon their faith and return to being productive citizens of society. Another 150,000 temple slaves would be freed and given citizenship, while another 500,000 non-monk followers of the faith that lived within temples were also evicted to return back to society. The land and wealth of all the temples destined to be removed would all be forfeited to the state, as this huge influx of wealth would end up enabling Emperor Yuan and the central government forces to defeat two of the Jiedushi rebellions during his reign. This entire event became known as the Huichang Huifo, or the Huichang persecution of Buddhism, that lasted from 845 to 846. The reason why this persecution or suppression of Buddhism would end in 846 is because Emperor Yuan, who was a staunch believer in Taoism, ended up dying suddenly in 846 at the age of 32 after consuming one of his alchemy elixir Zhan. With Yuan's sudden death, the eunuch faction, which had been suppressed, quickly made moves to regain control of the imperial palace, as they would once again pick the next emperor, and like before, they would not pick one of Yuan's sons, and this time, not even one of his younger brothers. Instead, they went back one entire generation, as they ended up picking Yuan's uncle, Chen, who was the 13th son of Emperor Chun and the younger brother of Emperor Heng. Now, despite being the uncle of Yuan, Chen was actually similar in age and was only 36 when he became emperor in 846. The reason why the eunuchs ended up picking him was mainly because he was considered by many to be a little mentally challenged as a kid ever since he was around 10 years old, simply because he really didn't like to talk, even when being talked to. And in those teenage years, he suffered through a particularly bad illness, so many had assumed that he was not well both mentally and physically, when in reality, he was just not very social and was quite reserved. In any case, the eunuchs all thought he would be the easiest imperial relative to control as a puppet emperor, and thus he was picked to inherit the throne. Yet this turned out far from the truth, as despite his reserved nature, Chen turned out to be a wise and hard-working emperor, as he managed to improve the efficiency of the administration by navigating and dissolving two of the major rivaling factions that had plagued the imperial court for the last decade. Internally, his success at controlling the imperial court gave him advantage as slowly stripping away the eunuch's power once again. Externally, under his leadership, the Tang Empire actually started to expand once again, as many of the neighboring empires such as the Tibetan Empire to the west and the Hui Islamic Empire to the north were undergoing their own periods of internal strife. On the home front, the central government forces had the upper hand against the Jiedushi, and for a period, Chen's reign showed signs of another mini golden age as the aging Tang dynasty underwent another renaissance. Emperor Chen's achievements even earned himself the nickname of Xiao Taizong, or Shimin Light, in a callback to one of the greatest Tang emperors. Yet, like many successful emperors before him, including Shimin, after enjoying success for over a decade on the throne, Chen's desires to remain on the throne drove him to alchemy and the search for everlasting life. And by 859, after 13 years on the throne, Chen would also die of heavy metal poisoning from the very dent that he had thought would extend his reign. At the time, Chen was just 49 years old. Now, for many of you who might be wondering why all these emperors and even many social elites in Chinese history were so willing to consume these dun, even though there are plenty of clear historical evidence that they know of showing that they do not work. The reason is, when you start to take a very trace amount of mercury, the first thing that happens to you is that your internal body temperature starts to go up a little bit, as you suddenly don't feel as cold in the winter. Then your skin starts to thin and grow pale, and for old people who might be showing their age through wrinkles, This process makes them look visibly younger as the skin thins and tightens while having this illustrious pale glow. This thinning process then progresses towards the cracking of your skin, often starting with your feet to the point where walking becomes incredibly painful. But for emperors and social elite who has servants that can carry them around, this pain is tolerated, as when the skin is cracking, it feels like you're being born again as new skin emerges underneath. Essentially, the whole process makes you feel like you're in the process of becoming an immortal who is now no longer looking old, no longer feeling cold, and no longer feeling hungry. Then suddenly, the poison crashes your organs and you die. But up until that point of no return, it does feel like it's working. And more importantly, once you start to see yourself being young again, it's very hard to just stop. Now, succeeding Emperor Li Chen would be his eldest son, Li Cui, who is also the emperor that is playable in the All Under Heavens DLC. And to hear the story of his life and the fate of the Tang Dynasty as it enters its final few decades, please make sure to tune in tomorrow, as I'll be kicking off my first playthrough of CK3 here on the channel with Emperor Li Cui, where we will spend most of our time discussing history and a little bit of time playing the game. So hopefully you have enjoyed this not so brief overview of the first 17th emperor of the Tang Dynasty and the only empress of the Zhou Dynasty. And since you made it to the end, why not hit the like button and subscribe to the channel, as I plan to make a lot more gameplay and historical videos covering the various playable Chinese clans and characters in the All Under Heaven DLC across all 3 start date. So until then, bye!